Imagine cruising down a quiet street in a picturesque small town, a town where you hold one of the most powerful positions, only to find flashing red and blue lights pulling you over. What happens next isn't just an encounter. It's a moment that reveals deeper truths about perception, respect, and the power of identity. Today's story explores a stunning interaction between a black man and two officers who had no idea who they were dealing with. What would you do if you were in his shoes? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more incredible stories like this. Your support helps us bring narratives that not only entertain, but also provoke thought and inspire change. Now, let's dive into today's tale. It was a bright and breezy afternoon in Crestview, a quaint town surrounded by rolling hills and narrow country roads. The streets were alive with the hum of daily activity, shopkeepers arranging displays, children playing outside, and locals stopping to chat on sidewalks. Among the serene hustle, a sleek black sedan rolled through the main street, catching the eye of anyone nearby. Inside the car was James Peterson, a man in his early 40s dressed in a tailored navy suit. His demeanor was calm but focused as he took in the sights of the town. For James, this drive was more than a casual trip. It was part of his vision to personally understand the pulse of the town he had recently been entrusted to lead as mayor. Parked at an intersection nearby, two police officers sat in their patrol car, watching the world go by. The younger officer, leaning lazily against the window, noticed the shiny car first. "Well, that's a rare sight around here," he said with a chuckle. His partner, older and more seasoned but equally curious, followed his gaze. "Fancy car for someone passing through," the senior officer remarked. "Looks like he doesn't belong here." Without another word, the younger officer flipped on the siren. James heard the sound and glanced in his rearview mirror. Calmly, he pulled his car over to the shoulder, coming to a gentle stop. He rolled down his window and waited patiently as the officers approached. "License and registration," barked the younger officer, his tone clipped and authoritative. James handed over the documents without hesitation, his face betraying no emotion. The second officer took the license and studied it for a moment, while his partner began inspecting the exterior of the car. "What brings you to Crestview?" the younger officer asked, leaning in closer than necessary. There was a faint trace of mockery in his voice. "Business or pleasure?" "Just here to check on some things," James replied, his tone calm and even. The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism growing. "You know," said the older officer, crossing his arms, "we don't usually see cars like this around here. Kind of stands out." James gave a polite smile, but remained silent, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. The younger officer, emboldened by the lack of resistance, continued, "Nice suit, nice car. You must be a big deal somewhere, huh?" Before James could respond, a crackle came through the officer's radio. The voice on the other end was firm and urgent, summoning both officers back to their car. The younger officer frowned and glanced at his partner. "Stay here," he ordered James, as if the man had any intention of leaving. Back in the patrol car, the officers listened intently to the transmission. As the words sank in, the color drained from their faces. James Peterson wasn't just anyone. He was their new mayor, the man who had been making headlines for his progressive ideas and bold promises to reform the town's policies, including law enforcement practices. The revelation hit them like a thunderbolt. Still standing by James's car, they hesitated, unsure how to proceed. But they knew one thing for certain. This routine stop had just turned into the biggest mistake of their careers. As the officers returned to James's car, their earlier arrogance was replaced by a hesitant stiffness. The younger officer handed back James's license and registration, his fingers trembling slightly. "You're good to go, sir," he said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. But James didn't start the car. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes meeting theirs in the rearview mirror. "Was there a reason for this stop?" he asked calmly, his voice carrying an air of quiet authority. The question seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The younger officer shuffled uncomfortably, glancing at his partner for support. Routine check," the older officer finally said, though even he sounded unconvinced by his own words. James nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. "Routine, huh?" he said, his tone still calm, but now edged with something sharper, something that made the officers shift uneasily. Interesting, because I don't recall breaking any traffic laws. The younger officer opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, realizing there was no justification he could offer. The older officer cleared his throat. "Just doing our job, sir," he mumbled, avoiding James's steady gaze. James leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate you doing your job," he said, "but I also expect that job to be done fairly and without bias. Don't you agree?" The officers nodded quickly, their discomfort growing by the second. James's calm demeanor only made their unease more pronounced, like they were being silently judged and coming up short. The younger officer, desperate to defuse the situation, attempted a weak smile. "Well, we're glad everything's in order, sir. Have a good day." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at them both carefully, as if committing their faces to memory. Then, with deliberate precision, he started the engine. "I hope the rest of your day is productive," he said evenly before pulling back onto the road. As the black sedan disappeared into the distance, the two officers stood frozen, their earlier bravado completely deflated. "What do we do now?" the younger officer muttered, his voice tinged with panic. "We don't mention this to anyone," the older officer snapped. "And we hope he doesn't either." But deep down, both men knew this encounter wouldn't end here. There was a distinct possibility that the man they had stopped, who was not only their mayor, but also a man who had promised to bring change, would remember this moment. And for the first time, they began to feel the creeping shadow of accountability looming over them. As James drove away, the tension in the air seemed to follow him. He glanced briefly in his rearview mirror, catching sight of the two officers standing by their patrol car, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and dread. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but his face remained calm. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was disappointed. Disappointed that, even in his position, he wasn't immune to these types of encounters. But this wasn't the first time James had faced such treatment, and he doubted it would be the last. What mattered now was how he would handle it. Instead of heading directly to his meeting, James took a slight detour, pulling into a quiet parking lot. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. After a moment's hesitation, he hit call. "Chief Reynolds," James said as the voice on the other end answered. "This is James Carter. I need to speak with you regarding an incident that just occurred involving two of your officers." There was a pause on the line, followed by the chief's measured response. "Of course, Mr. Carter. What happened?" James explained the encounter in detail, his tone steady but firm. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. He didn't need to. The facts alone were enough to make a point. Chief Reynolds listened in silence, but James could sense the unease in his voice when he finally responded. "I'll launch an internal review immediately, Mr. Carter. This will be handled." "I trust it will," James said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I'd like to address this personally at the department tomorrow. Make sure those officers are present." Chief Reynolds hesitated for a moment, but finally agreed. "Understood, sir." As James ended the call, he sat in his car for a moment, staring at the dashboard. This wasn't about revenge or making an example of anyone. It was about accountability and ensuring that the values he stood for were upheld, even among those tasked with enforcing the law. He took a deep breath, glanced at his watch, and resumed his journey. The day's events had added an unexpected weight to his schedule, but James was no stranger to carrying heavy burdens. And as he drove toward the city council building, a quiet resolve settled over him. By the time James arrived at his meeting, he was composed and focused. But in the back of his mind, he was already thinking about tomorrow, about the conversation he would have with the police department, about the changes that needed to happen, not just for him, but for everyone in the community. This wasn't just about one incident or two officers. It was about building a system where fairness and respect were not optional, but mandatory. And James was determined to see it through. The morning of the meeting arrived, and James Carter stood before his mirror, adjusting his tie. His expression was calm, but his mind was focused. Today wasn't just about addressing an incident. It was about setting a precedent. The meeting was scheduled at the police department's headquarters, a place James had visited many times before, but today, the stakes felt different. As he approached the building, His presence was noticed immediately. Officers greeted him with a mix of respect and apprehension, aware of the importance of his visit. Inside the conference room, Chief Reynolds was waiting, along with a small group of senior officers. The two officers from the previous day were also present, standing stiffly near the back of the room. They avoided James's gaze, their discomfort evident. James took his seat at the head of the table, his composure commanding attention. The room fell silent as Chief Reynolds cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Carter," he began. "We've reviewed the preliminary details of yesterday's incident, and I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously." James nodded, but didn't immediately respond. Instead, he placed his hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Chief Reynolds," he said, his voice steady, "this isn't about me. This is about the culture within this department and how we ensure that every member of this community is treated with respect and dignity." He glanced briefly at the two officers, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "Yesterday's incident was avoidable," James continued. "It was a failure of judgment, training, and professionalism. But more than that, it was a failure to uphold the values we claim to stand for." Chief Reynolds nodded, his expression somber. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Carter. We've already begun implementing measures to address these issues, including additional training and oversight." James listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Training is a good start," he said, "but it's not enough. Accountability must be at the forefront. These incidents erode trust, not just between the community and the department, but within the community itself." One of the senior officers shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "With respect, Mr. Carter, we've made significant progress in recent years. This was an isolated incident." James cut him off with a raised hand, his tone firm but measured. "Progress is not an excuse for complacency. This incident may feel isolated to you, but for many in this city, it's a reflection of something far bigger. And until that perception changes, progress means little." The room fell silent again, the weight of James's words hanging in the air. After a moment, Chief Reynolds spoke up. "We understand, Mr. Carter, and I give you my word. We will address this with the seriousness it deserves." James nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I trust you will. But trust is built on actions, not words. I'll be watching closely, Chief Reynolds. The people of this city deserve nothing less." As the meeting concluded, James rose from his seat, offering a firm handshake to Chief Reynolds. The two officers who had stopped him the previous day remained silent, their faces etched with a mixture of regret and fear. As James left the building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The meeting was a step forward, but there was still much work to be done. And James was determined to see it through, because for him, this wasn't just about a single incident. It was about creating a future where respect and fairness were not aspirations, but expectations. As James Carter stepped out of the police station, he couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting had barely scratched the surface. The city's problems ran deeper than a single traffic stop. Still, it was progress, measured, cautious progress. The cool morning breeze brushed past him as he walked to his car. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from an old colleague, Marcus, someone who had seen firsthand the challenges James faced daily as mayor. "Call me. Something's come up." James frowned, but quickly dialed Marcus's number. Marcus answered on the second ring. "James, I've been hearing some chatter. That meeting you just had? It's stirring up some waves." James stopped in his tracks. "What kind of waves?" Marcus hesitated. "It's not just about the officers involved in the stop yesterday. There's talk about a deeper issue. Corruption cover-ups. Some of the senior officers might be hiding more than they're letting on." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had suspected there were systemic issues, but corruption? That would take things to a whole new level. "How reliable is this information?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Reliable enough," Marcus replied. "I've got a contact who's been digging into this for months. They say there's a paper trail, but it's buried deep. If this is true, James, it's not just a few bad apples. It's the tree." James took a deep breath, his mind racing. This wasn't just about holding two officers accountable anymore. This was about dismantling a system that allowed such behavior to thrive. But he couldn't act impulsively. He needed proof. Can you set up a meeting with your contact? James asked. Already in motion, Marcus said. But be careful, James. If you go after this, you'll make enemies. Powerful ones. James hung up, his resolve hardening. He had faced adversity before, and he wasn't about to back down now. But he needed to tread carefully. The last thing he wanted was to make accusations without evidence. Later that evening, James sat in his office, poring over reports and files. His assistant, David, knocked on the door before stepping inside. Sir, there's something you should see, David said, handing James a folder. What is it? James asked, opening the folder. Inside were records, disciplinary actions, internal memos, and complaints filed against several senior officers. The pattern was clear. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger problem. David hesitated before speaking again. There's more. An anonymous source sent this to me earlier today. He handed James a flash drive. James plugged it into his computer, and a series of emails popped up on the screen. They detailed conversations between high-ranking officers, discussing ways to suppress complaints and manipulate investigations. One email, in particular, caught James's attention. A reference to Project Horizon. The details were vague, but the tone suggested something sinister. What's Project Horizon? James asked, looking up at David. I don't know, David admitted. But it doesn't sound good. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had imagined. The twist wasn't just that the officers involved in his traffic stop were unprofessional. It was that they might be pawns in a much larger, more dangerous game. The pieces were starting to come together. But James knew he couldn't confront this alone. He needed allies, and he needed to proceed strategically. The next steps would be critical, and the stakes couldn't be higher. For now, he decided to focus on the immediate task, holding the officers accountable for their actions. But as he prepared for his next move, the shadow of Project Horizon loomed large, promising a twist that would change everything. James Carter didn't sleep that night. The weight of what he had uncovered gnawed at him, pushing him into a relentless cycle of analysis. What was Project Horizon? Why had it been so carefully buried? He knew it was tied to the department, but the details remained elusive. By morning, James had a plan. He called Marcus again. I need your contact to meet me as soon as possible, he said, pacing his office. We're not just dealing with a traffic stop anymore. This could shake the entire department. Understood, Marcus replied. But tread lightly, James. If you push too hard, they'll come after you. Later that day, James met with Marcus's contact, a retired investigative journalist named Henry Fields. Henry had spent years exposing corruption and had the scars to prove it. He slid a thick folder across the table. I've been digging into this for months, Henry began. Project Horizon isn't just a code name. It's a coordinated effort. They've been using it to cover up misconduct, embezzle funds, and silence anyone who tries to expose them. James's stomach tightened as he flipped through the folder. The evidence was damning. Financial records, altered case files, and even witness testimonies that had been suppressed. Why hasn't this come out before? James asked, his voice heavy with frustration. Fear, Henry said bluntly. And power. The people behind this aren't just officers. They're connected to politicians, business leaders, even the media. They've built a fortress around themselves. James leaned back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about dismantling a system that thrived on inequality and abuse. But Henry wasn't done. There's one more thing you need to see. He pulled out a single sheet of paper with a list of names. These are people who've tried to expose Project Horizon. Most of them were forced out of their jobs. A few didn't survive. James felt a chill run down his spine. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined. But as he scanned the list, one name stood out. Marcus. Marcus was involved? James asked, his voice low. He was one of the first to come to me, Henry explained. But after his first attempt to expose this, he was silenced, demoted, harassed, and eventually pushed out of the force. He knew if he stayed, he'd be next on their list. James clenched his fists. This wasn't just about his position as mayor. It was personal now. The system that had targeted Marcus was the same one that had tried to humiliate him during the traffic stop. Before Henry left, he handed James a USB drive. This is everything I've gathered. Use it wisely. James nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew what he had to do. But as he prepared for the next phase, he also knew he couldn't act alone. He needed allies, and he needed to be strategic. As he sat in his office that night, James began crafting a plan. The officers who had stopped him might have been the tip of the iceberg, but the storm brewing beneath the surface was far more dangerous. The seeds of the twist in Part 3 were planted. What would James discover next? And how deep did Project Horizon go? Only time would tell. James Carter woke up the next morning with a single goal: dismantle Project Horizon. He knew the fight would be dangerous, but there was no turning back. Armed with the evidence from Henry Fields, James decided to make his first move by reaching out to an old ally, former Detective Elijah Moore. Elijah had left the force years ago after a scandal involving corrupt officers. Unlike Marcus, Elijah hadn't just been pushed out. He'd been framed for a crime he didn't commit. He had spent years rebuilding his life, but his knowledge of the department's dark secrets was unparalleled. James found Elijah working at a private security firm on the outskirts of the city. When James explained what he had discovered, Elijah's expression darkened. "I've heard whispers about Project Horizon," Elijah admitted. "But if what you're saying is true, it's worse than I thought." James handed him the USB drive. "This is everything we need to expose them. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who knows how they operate, someone who can predict their moves." Elijah leaned back in his chair, studying James. "You realize what you're asking, right? If we go after these people, they'll come after us with everything they've got." James nodded. "I do. But this isn't just about me, or even you. This is about stopping them from ruining more lives. They think they can act without consequences. It's time to show them they're wrong." Elijah's hesitation faded. He extended his hand, and James shook it firmly. "All right," Elijah said. "I'm in. But we'll need to be smart about this. If they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll bury us before we can make a move." The two men spent hours developing a plan. Their first target was Officer Bennett, one of the cops who had stopped James during the traffic stop. According to Henry's files, Bennett was deeply involved in Project Horizon, handling payouts and ensuring that critical evidence was destroyed. "We need to find something on Bennett," Elijah said. "Something they can't cover up or explain away. If we take him down, it'll send a message to the others." That evening, James and Elijah parked outside Bennett's house, observing him from a distance. They weren't just looking for dirt. They were looking for patterns, weaknesses, anything they could use. As they watched, Bennett left his house and drove to a storage unit on the outskirts of town. Elijah's eyes narrowed. "That's interesting. Why would he be going there at this hour?" James nodded. "Let's find out." The two men followed at a safe distance, careful not to be seen. When Bennett unlocked the storage unit, they caught a glimpse of what was inside: stacks of boxes, envelopes stuffed with cash, and what appeared to be confiscated evidence. Elijah smirked. "Looks like we found his treasure trove." James pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Once we expose Bennett, the rest of them will start to sweat. And when they do, they'll make mistakes." But as they drove away, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The stakes were rising, and the danger was becoming more real by the second. As James and Elijah sifted through the photos they had taken of Bennett's storage unit, they realized the trove was more significant than they first thought. Among the cash and confiscated items, they had spotted police case files. These weren't ordinary files. They contained information on individuals targeted by Project Horizon. "This isn't just dirty money," Elijah said, flipping through the images on James's laptop. "These files prove they're actively sabotaging certain people's lives. Look here. This guy's record was fabricated. This one lost his business because of planted evidence. They're ruining lives to keep their operation running." James clenched his fists. "This isn't just corruption. This is systemic destruction. If we can get those files, we can bring the entire operation crashing down." But getting the files wouldn't be easy. The storage unit was under surveillance, and any attempt to break in would trigger an alarm. Elijah suggested a more subtle approach. They would tail Bennett and wait for an opportunity to catch him off guard. The next day, they followed Bennett to a secluded diner where he met with another officer, Lieutenant Harris. Harris had a reputation for being untouchable, someone who always seemed to rise above controversy. If Harris was involved, it meant Project Horizon's reach extended further than they had feared. James and Elijah discreetly listened from a booth nearby, using a hidden microphone to record the conversation. "Everything's in place," Bennett said. "The mayor's office is under control, and the council will pass the zoning changes next week. Once that's done, we can move forward with the new acquisitions." Harris nodded. "Good. Make sure no one finds out about the storage unit. If that evidence gets out, we're all finished." James exchanged a glance with Elijah. This was the confirmation they needed. Not only was Bennett's storage unit central to their operation, but it also implicated higher-ranking officials like Harris. But just as they prepared to leave the diner, things took an unexpected turn. A man in a dark suit entered and sat down at their booth. His sharp eyes darted between James and Elijah. "You think you're clever, don't you?" the man said, his voice cold. "Following Bennett, snooping around where you don't belong. You have no idea what you're up against." James tensed, but Elijah stayed calm. "And who might you be?" Elijah asked, leaning back casually. "Let's just say I represent interests that don't appreciate interference," the man replied. "This is your only warning. Drop this crusade, or you won't like the consequences." Before James or Elijah could respond, the man stood and walked out, leaving them stunned. "What was that?" James asked, his voice low. "That," Elijah said grimly, "was a sign we're getting too close to the truth. But it also means we're on the right track." "They're scared, James. And scared people make mistakes." As they left the diner, James couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. They had uncovered a deeper conspiracy than they had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. But now they had to be careful, because whoever was protecting Project Horizon wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got in their way. The warning they received at the diner wasn't enough to deter James and Elijah. If anything, it only solidified their resolve. But they had to be careful. Every move they made now carried immense risk. Bennett, Harris, and the mysterious man at the diner were just the surface of a much deeper network. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop or even one crooked project. This went all the way to the top. The next few days were tense. James and Elijah continued their investigation, but now they were constantly looking over their shoulders. Every phone call, every new lead, every step they took was monitored. They knew their window of opportunity was closing fast. Their focus was on the storage unit, the key to everything. But they needed a foolproof plan to access it without getting caught. Elijah had a contact who worked as a locksmith. She was a skilled technician who had worked in the shadows for years, helping people get in and out of tight situations. After a few discreet calls, she agreed to help, but only if they could guarantee her safety. The last thing she needed was to be dragged into something this dangerous. "I'll meet you tomorrow," she told Elijah, "but we need to be in and out in under 10 minutes. No time to waste. You pull this off, and I'll make sure the evidence goes straight to the right people." James and Elijah spent the entire night preparing. They gathered everything they might need: tools, gadgets, and a backup plan in case things went south. Elijah wasn't usually the type to worry, but as they drove to the storage unit the next morning, a strange feeling settled in his gut. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as they approached the area. It was too quiet, too still. The locksmith arrived as planned, and they quickly got to work. But just as she was about to open the lock, a car screeched to a halt in front of them. James's heart sank as he saw a familiar face step out: Lieutenant Harris. "Thought you could sneak in, did you?" Harris said, a smirk on his face. "You really think you're the first ones to try and dig into Project Horizon? You're in way over your heads." The locksmith froze, her hands shaking. James and Elijah exchanged a quick glance. They had no choice but to act. Elijah grabbed a stun gun from his bag and hit Harris with a quick jolt. The lieutenant dropped to the ground, unconscious. They quickly moved Harris's body to the side, but the clock was ticking. They had minutes to get into the unit, and the whole operation could go south at any second. They could hear voices in the distance. Backup was on the way. With trembling hands, the locksmith cracked the lock, and the storage unit door creaked open. What they saw inside left them breathless. Stacks of official government documents, case files, and photographs filled the room. Everything they needed to bring down Project Horizon was right in front of them. But as they rifled through the papers, James noticed something even more chilling: a list of names, some of which were familiar. Men they knew, people they'd worked with, allies they had trusted. "Elijah, look at this," James whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "They've been watching us the whole time. They knew we'd come for this." Elijah's face turned pale as he scanned the list. "They've been preparing for us. They want to make sure no one exposes them. We have to get this to the authorities now, before they come for us." But as the weight of their discovery sank in, a new reality dawned on them. The stakes had just been raised. Project Horizon wasn't just a corrupt police operation. It was a global conspiracy, one that reached into every corner of their lives. And now, they were its next target. As they loaded the files into their car, they knew the fight had only just begun. The most dangerous part of the battle was still ahead of them. But the one thing they had going for them was the truth. And that truth, no matter how hard they fought, was something they couldn't let go. They had to stop Project Horizon before it stopped them. The tension was palpable as James and Elijah made their way to the safe house, the stolen documents securely hidden in a duffel bag between them. The sun had barely begun to set, but everything felt like it was closing in. The thrill of their discovery was overshadowed by the constant sense of danger. Every turn, every stoplight seemed like it could be their last. They both knew they had to act fast. Any delay could mean the difference between success and an untimely end. As they approached the safe house, Elijah's phone buzzed. It was a text from the locksmith. She'd managed to get the key evidence to the authorities, but she warned them. They know you're in the city. They've already started moving." James didn't need to ask who they were. It was the men who had been tracking their every move, the same men who had corrupted the system from the top down. The higher-ups of Project Horizon had been preparing for this moment, and now they were coming for James and Elijah. As soon as they entered the safe house, they started working on a plan. They couldn't stay there long. The authorities would soon be compromised, and the clock was ticking. They needed to get the documents out of the country, somewhere safe, where no one could find them. But where? Who could they trust at this point? Elijah paced back and forth, trying to think. The safe house was too close to the action, too exposed. They needed a new ally, someone on the inside who could help them without revealing their location. But who could that be? James's mind went back to something he'd heard from an old colleague in the force, a man named Mark Turner. Turner had been part of a covert operation years ago, one that never saw the light of day. James remembered the man as trustworthy, loyal, a good cop who'd been pushed out after questioning the system. Maybe, just maybe, Turner was the answer. "Elijah, I have an idea," James said, his voice filled with determination. "Mark Turner. He's off the grid, but he owes me a favor. He's been on the inside of some dangerous stuff before, and he has connections we can use." Elijah looked skeptical. "You trust him? After everything we've seen, after all the betrayal, I don't have a choice. We don't have time to find someone else. And this isn't just about us anymore. This is about stopping what's coming." With no other viable options, they decided to make the call. James dialed Mark Turner's number, praying that he'd answer. It had been years since they'd spoken, and James knew there was a chance Turner might not even pick up. But to his relief, after several rings, a familiar voice echoed through the line. "James," Turner said, his voice low and urgent. "I've been waiting for your call. I knew you'd come." Relief washed over James. "Mark, we need your help. It's bigger than we thought. The project, they're watching everything. We've got the proof, but we need a way out." Turner's tone shifted immediately. "You're in deep, aren't you? I know exactly what you're up against. But there's no time to waste. They'll be looking for you. And when they do, they'll find you. We need you to get the documents out of the country," James said, his voice steady despite the pressure. "I have a safe house, but it's too close. We need somewhere remote, where they won't find us." Turner paused for a moment. "I've got a few people I trust. We'll make it happen. But James, you need to be ready for a fight. This is about to get real messy. And when the storm hits, you won't have a second to think." James nodded, even though Turner couldn't see him. "We're ready. We have to be." As soon as the call ended, James and Elijah packed up the last of their things. They had no time to waste. Turner had agreed to meet them, but it would take a few hours to make the arrangements. In the meantime, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The calm before the storm was unsettling. Something was lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. They grabbed what they could carry and left the safe house, knowing it wouldn't be safe for long. As they made their way through the streets, Elijah couldn't help but notice how quiet everything had become. The once bustling city now seemed eerily silent, as if everyone had disappeared. The only sound was the hum of their car engine as they drove toward an uncertain future. But in the back of his mind, Elijah couldn't escape the feeling that they had missed something. A small detail, something crucial, that could change everything. There was more to this than they could see. And the moment they walked into Turner's trap, they would finally understand just how deep the conspiracy went. As the hours passed, the tension grew thicker. James and Elijah arrived at the designated meeting point, a rundown warehouse on the edge of the city, far from any major roads or residential areas. The kind of place where shady deals and dangerous exchanges were routine. But tonight, it felt different. The air was thick with anticipation. Each step they took toward the door seemed heavier, as though the weight of the documents they carried was bearing down on them. "Stay sharp," James muttered under his breath. His instincts, honed through years on the force, screamed at him that something was off. He could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just another clandestine meeting. This was the moment that would determine everything. Elijah wasn't as convinced. He had his doubts about Turner. Sure, James and Turner had history, but after everything that had happened, Elijah wasn't so sure they could trust anyone. The whole world seemed to be stacked against them, with betrayal lurking around every corner. He'd seen too many friends fall victim to deceit and corruption. When they reached the entrance, James knocked in the agreed-upon pattern, and after a moment, the door creaked open. Standing in the dim light was Mark Turner, his face obscured by the shadow of his hooded jacket. He looked just as James remembered, stoic, calculating, but there was something more in his eyes, a wariness that James hadn't seen before. "You're late," Turner said curtly, his voice low. "I thought you'd be here sooner." James stepped forward, holding up his hand in greeting. "You know how things go. But we got the documents, and we're ready to move." Turner gave a quick glance over his shoulder before motioning for them to follow. "You're lucky I'm still here. The people I'm working with are starting to get nervous about this. But don't worry. You're in good hands now. I've arranged for safe passage. Once you're out, you won't have to worry about the project anymore." But as they walked deeper into the warehouse, a nagging feeling crept up on James. The room was too quiet. No one else was around. Normally, Turner worked with a small team, people James could trust. But the place felt abandoned. And then, it hit him. Turner was stalling. "Where is everyone?" James asked, keeping his tone neutral but firm. Turner glanced back, a brief flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "They're getting things ready. We'll be moving soon. But first, we need to secure the evidence. It's the only way to make sure we're all safe." James didn't buy it. He had known Turner long enough to know when something wasn't right. There was a shift in Turner's demeanor, and the conversation wasn't going in the direction James had hoped. He looked at Elijah, silently conveying the same thoughts. The walls were closing in, and they needed to be ready for anything. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine revving outside broke the silence. It was too loud, too close. James's heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of noise that made you feel like you were being cornered. Before he could react, the lights inside the warehouse flickered, casting everything in a sickly yellow hue. For a split second, everything was quiet again, and then, crash! The door at the far end of the warehouse exploded inward, sending a wave of dust and debris into the air. Men in tactical gear rushed in, their faces obscured by masks, weapons drawn. James immediately recognized the insignia on their uniforms, government agents working for Project Horizon. They had found them. "Get down!" James shouted as he pushed Elijah behind a stack of crates for cover. Turner's face twisted into a look of grim satisfaction. "I warned you, James. You should have known better. You think you can take down a system this powerful without consequences? You're nothing but pawns in a game you don't understand." James felt his pulse race as he pulled out his gun. "You set us up?" Turner's smile faded, and in that instant, James realized the truth. Turner had never been an ally. He was part of the system they were trying to destroy. He had lured them here to finish what they started, eliminate them, and secure the evidence for himself. "Elijah, listen to me," James hissed, his eyes scanning the room for a way out. "We need to make a break for it. Now." But as James prepared to take action, another figure appeared from behind Turner. A familiar face, Detective Williams, the man who had been hunting them from the beginning. James couldn't believe it. Williams had been playing both sides, feeding information to the enemy, all while pretending to help James. "It's over, James," Williams said, his voice calm but full of finality. "You should have stayed out of this. Now you're a liability to everyone involved." Elijah's voice shook with disbelief. "You're with them?" Williams didn't answer, his gaze fixed on James with cold, unyielding resolve. James's mind raced. They had no way out. Surrounded, betrayed by everyone they had trusted, they were facing the end. But there was one thing James knew for sure. No matter how many times they were knocked down, they would never give up the fight. Not until the truth came out. The clock was ticking, and the storm had finally hit. James's mind was racing, his thoughts spinning faster than the dangerous situation they found themselves in. He couldn't believe it. Turner had set them up, and now, Detective Williams had shown his true colors. The people they thought they could trust were working against them. Every decision they had made, every move they had planned, was now hanging in the balance. The stakes had never been higher. The government agents advanced, their weapons trained on James and Elijah. The tension in the room was palpable. The seconds dragged on like hours, each one adding weight to the sense of inevitability in the air. James knew they had to act fast, or they would be finished. "Get out of the way," one of the agents barked, his voice sharp and commanding. But James wasn't about to give up so easily. "No," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We're not going down without a fight." He could see Elijah, his hands shaking as he clutched his gun, his face pale. James knew Elijah was scared. Hell, he was scared too. But they couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. Not when everything they had worked for was on the line. Suddenly, James's instincts kicked in. He had no time to waste. He grabbed Elijah's arm and yanked him toward the far corner of the warehouse. "Move!" he yelled, and they bolted, running as fast as they could, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. As they rounded a stack of crates, James heard the loud crack of gunfire behind them. The agents were closing in, but there was no way they were going to let themselves get captured. Not like this. Think. James muttered to himself, his mind scrambling for a way out. They needed a diversion, something that would buy them just enough time to escape. And then it hit him. James had seen an old, rusted fuse box on the wall when they entered the warehouse. If he could get to it, he could short-circuit the power and plunge the place into darkness. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had left. He turned to Elijah, his voice low. "Follow me. We're making a run for the fuse box." Elijah nodded, still wide-eyed with disbelief, but desperate enough to trust James. They dashed across the warehouse floor, zigzagging between crates, their feet pounding the concrete as they tried to outmaneuver the agents. The sound of footsteps and shouting grew louder behind them, but James didn't dare look back. They reached the fuse box, and James quickly pried open the metal door. He wasn't an electrician, but he had enough experience from his years on the force to know how to cause a short circuit. With a swift motion, he yanked a few wires free and twisted them together. Sparks flew, and the lights in the warehouse flickered and then went out, leaving them in total darkness. For a moment, there was silence, and then chaos erupted. The agents cursed as they tried to regain their bearings in the dark. James and Elijah didn't wait around to see what would happen next. They turned and ran, using the confusion to their advantage. "Stay close," James shouted, guiding them through the maze of crates and shadows. The sound of running footsteps echoed in the distance, but the agents were struggling to find their way in the darkness. James and Elijah kept moving, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Just when they thought they had made it to the door, a flash of light cut through the darkness. A spotlight from outside the warehouse illuminated the area, casting long, menacing shadows. James and Elijah froze, realizing they had reached the end of their escape route. "Turner," James hissed, his voice full of fury. "You promised us a way out." Turner's voice came from the shadows, cold and detached. You should have known better, James. You were never meant to escape. This was always going to be the end for you. But James wasn't ready to give up just yet. He grabbed Elijah by the arm and pulled him toward the back exit, where a rusted fire escape ladder led to the roof. It was their last chance. We're going up, James said through gritted teeth. We'll make it to the roof and find another way out. Elijah didn't argue. They scaled the ladder quickly, their hands and feet scrambling for purchase as they pulled themselves up. When they reached the top, they paused to catch their breath. The night sky was clear above them, the sound of sirens in the distance. James knew they didn't have much time. Stay low, James instructed, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of pursuit. We're not safe yet. But just as they were about to make their move, a voice from behind them stopped them cold. Going somewhere? James spun around, heart racing. The figure that emerged from the shadows was none other than Detective Williams. His gun was raised, his eyes cold as ice. You didn't think I'd let you just walk away, did you? Williams said, his voice low and steady. James and Elijah were trapped once again, the walls closing in. But James wasn't ready to let it end here. Not yet. Not when the truth was so close to being revealed. The air was thick with tension as James and Elijah faced Detective Williams on the rooftop. Every part of James's body screamed for him to run, to do something, anything, to get away. But there was nowhere to go. The dim light from the streetlights below cast long shadows across the rooftop, making everything feel even more suffocating. Williams's gun was still trained on them, but there was something different in his eyes now. It wasn't just cold indifference anymore. There was fear too. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what James and Elijah had been digging into. Something that was bigger than any of them. You're not going to get away with this, James said, his voice steady but tinged with defiance. You think you can just keep covering this up, but the truth is coming out, Williams. You can't stop it. Williams narrowed his eyes, his hand tightening around the gun. You're naive if you think this is about truth, he spat. This is about power. And right now, I hold all of it. James could feel his heart racing. The weight of the situation was almost unbearable. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a way out, a twist in the story that could turn everything around. He just had to figure out how to make it happen. We'll see about that, James replied, barely above a whisper, before turning his attention to Elijah. The younger man looked lost, his face pale with fear, but there was a glimmer of determination in his eyes. James could see it. Elijah wasn't ready to let this end here either. Suddenly, James heard a soft sound, almost imperceptible, a click. It was a subtle shift in the tension in the air, but it was enough for him to sense that something was about to happen. Williams's face betrayed a flicker of unease, his eyes darting to the side as if he had heard something too. For the briefest of moments, James saw his opportunity. He didn't hesitate. Elijah now? James shouted, as he dove to the side, knocking Williams's arm just as the detective fired. The shot missed, but the momentum caused Williams to lose his balance, and he stumbled backwards. Elijah was already moving, charging forward with unexpected speed. He grabbed hold of Williams's gun arm and twisted, knocking the weapon out of his hand in one smooth motion. It clattered to the rooftop, but Williams was far from done. He lunged at Elijah, fists swinging in fury. The two men struggled, their bodies colliding with force as they grappled. James scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through him as he watched the scene unfold. He knew Elijah had been in tight situations before, but this was different. Williams was a trained officer, a dangerous adversary. James's heart raced as he searched for anything that could help. His eyes landed on a loose piece of metal from the roof's edge. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him the chance he needed. He grabbed it, ready to intervene, but before he could move, a voice echoed through the alley below. "Drop the weapon. Police!" James froze. The sound of sirens was growing louder, and more officers were closing in. Williams, realizing the situation was spiraling out of his control, kicked Elijah off him and scrambled to retrieve his gun. "Get away from him, James!" Williams shouted, his voice laced with venom. But James didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gaze steady as he prepared for what was coming next. The night had taken too many unexpected turns for him to let fear control his actions now. There was a moment of silence, One fleeting instant where everything hung in the balance. The officers below were close, and soon the rooftop would be surrounded. But James wasn't backing down. The truth was too close. And James was determined to make sure it saw the light of day, no matter what it cost him. As the sirens blared louder and closer, a final twist in the story was about to unfold, one that neither James nor Williams could have anticipated. The tension in the air seemed to freeze as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. James's mind raced. He couldn't afford to waste time, not now. The truth was on the edge of being exposed, but they still had to make it out of this alive. He quickly glanced over at Elijah, who had managed to regain his footing and was now trying to catch his breath, still clearly shaken but determined. "Stay down, Elijah," James muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We gotta be quick." Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning the rooftop as he moved closer to James. The two of them were now in sync, their movements sharp, their focus unwavering. They had spent too long trying to uncover the truth to let it slip away now. The question was, how were they going to escape? Williams, realizing he was losing control of the situation, started to backpedal. He couldn't fight both of them at once, not with the weight of the truth bearing down on him. His hands were shaking as he reached for his radio, his desperation evident. "This isn't over," Williams spat, but there was something different in his voice now, fear. He knew his back was against the wall. The very foundation of his power was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. James moved quickly, his eyes catching a glimpse of something through the dim light, a window on the side of the building that led to the fire escape. He grabbed Elijah's arm and pulled him toward it. "We have one chance," James said, urgency in his tone. "We need to move now." They darted toward the window, their hearts pounding in their chests. The window wasn't locked, and within seconds, they had slipped through and were on the fire escape. The sounds of approaching officers echoed in the distance, but the two of them were already several steps ahead. But as they descended the fire escape, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His instincts told him that the officers outside were just the beginning of their problems. The deeper they got into this story, the more dangerous it became. The people behind this corruption were powerful, and they wouldn't let anything or anyone stand in their way. As they reached the bottom of the fire escape, James spotted a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, but there was something about it that made James feel uneasy. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it was clear that they weren't just dealing with local officers anymore. This was bigger. Just as they were about to make a move, a voice called out from the shadows. "You're not getting away that easy." Both James and Elijah froze. The voice was low and calm, but there was an undeniable authority behind it. James turned, his body tense as he tried to gauge who it was. Emerging from the darkness, a figure stepped into the streetlight, and James felt his stomach drop. It was Detective Williams again. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were two other men with him, both wearing black suits, their faces hidden in the shadows. One of them held something in his hand, a phone, but not just any phone. James recognized it instantly, the mayor's phone. Williams's voice was cold. "You two have been digging in places you shouldn't. And now, you're going to pay the price." James's heart sank as he realized just how much trouble they were in. The pieces were coming together, and this wasn't just about a corrupt officer anymore. There were people at the highest levels involved, people who were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. But James wasn't about to back down. He stepped forward, his voice steady, but laced with determination. "You can't stop us, Williams. The truth is out there, and it's coming for you." The two men in suits exchanged a glance, and one of them reached into his jacket. James braced himself for whatever was coming next. But instead of pulling out a weapon, the man pulled out a small envelope and tossed it toward James. "Take it," the man said, his tone surprisingly calm. "You think you're the first to try to uncover this? You're not. But maybe you'll be the last." James hesitated for a moment before picking up the envelope. He tore it open and pulled out a single piece of paper. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, his mind racing as he processed the information. It was a list of names. High-ranking officials, judges, businessmen, all connected to the corrupt network James had been investigating. But there was something more, something that made James's blood run cold. The last name on the list was his own. Elijah stepped forward, his voice shaky but fierce. "What is this? A threat?" The man in the suit gave a short, dark laugh. "No, it's a warning. Stay out of this, and you'll both walk away unscathed. Keep going, and you won't live to see another day." James's hand tightened around the paper. He wasn't sure what to do, but one thing was clear. He couldn't back down now. The truth was too important, and he was already too deep to turn back. "We're not stopping," James said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You'll regret underestimating us." The two men in suits exchanged a look, but before they could respond, a loud noise from behind them caught their attention. Another car pulled up, and this time, it wasn't the authorities. It was something much worse. The game had just gotten even more dangerous. And James knew that they were playing for stakes higher than they could have ever imagined. The moment the black SUV pulled up, the tension in the air became suffocating. James and Elijah stood frozen, their hearts pounding in unison as the car's headlights illuminated their path. But the figure stepping out wasn't anyone they recognized. At least, not at first. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and exuded an aura of power that sent chills down their spines. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hood, but as he walked toward them, there was no mistaking the glint of cold, calculating authority in his eyes. This was no ordinary man. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice unwavering despite the fear tightening in his chest. The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather briefcase, which he opened slowly, revealing a set of documents. The briefcase gleamed under the streetlights, reflecting the sharp, almost predatory glint in the stranger's eyes. "I'm someone who knows what's at stake here," the man finally said, his voice low but commanding. "You two have been poking around in places you shouldn't, stirring up things better left untouched. But now, you're in deeper than you realize." Elijah took a step back, his hand instinctively moving to his side, ready for whatever might come next. But James, ever the strategist, kept his focus. He needed to understand who this man was and what he wanted. "What's your game?" James asked, his voice steady, but his eyes scanning for any signs of a threat. "What do you want from us?" The man's lips curled into a cold smile, but there was no warmth in it, only an unsettling sense of control. "What I want," he said, "is simple. I want you both to disappear. Stop digging into this. Stop fighting it." James's mind raced, his instincts telling him this wasn't just some random enforcer. This was someone with power, someone who had the resources to make both of them vanish without a trace. "Do you think you're the first to try?" James asked, his voice growing firm with conviction. "We've already uncovered too much. We won't stop now." The man sighed, as though he were almost pitying James. "It's not about whether you stop or not. It's about the fact that you're already in a position where you can't win. You're walking on a path that leads nowhere but destruction." He reached for the briefcase again, pulling out another envelope, this one much thicker than the last. "Consider this your final warning," the man continued, tossing the envelope toward James. "You think the mayor's office and the police are the only forces you're up against? You got no idea just how deep this goes." James hesitated, but then picked up the envelope. His hand shook slightly as he opened it, and his eyes scanned the contents, rapidly absorbing the names listed on the paper. His blood ran cold when he realized these weren't just ordinary names. They were the names of some of the most powerful figures in the city, including some whose influence stretched far beyond local politics. But one name stood out to him, the last one on the list, James Porter. His heart skipped a beat. This was no coincidence. The man in the suit had been watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to pull him into this dangerous web of corruption. They were willing to use any means necessary to keep him silent. "I don't take threats lightly," James said, his voice laced with defiance. He glanced at Elijah, whose eyes were wide with shock, but filled with determination. They were in too deep to back out now. They had come too far. The man gave them one last, cold look before slowly backing away. "You're not listening. There's no escape. You'll regret pushing this further." Without another word, he turned, stepping back into the SUV, the doors slamming shut with a sense of finality. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off into the night, leaving James and Elijah standing there, more determined than ever. The silence that followed was deafening. They both knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no turning back now. But the truth was out there, and no matter how much danger they faced, they were not going to stop until it was revealed. James's eyes burned with resolve. He knew that they had the evidence they needed. The game was no longer about finding answers. It was about survival. The forces they were up against weren't just corrupt officials. They were a network that spanned generations, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But James had one thing they didn't: the truth. And he would fight with everything he had to expose it. As the last of the SUV's headlights disappeared into the distance, Elijah spoke, his voice quiet but unwavering. "We can't stop now. We're too far in." James nodded. "We finish this together." And with that, they disappeared into the shadows, knowing that the hardest part of their journey was only just beginning. If you're captivated by James and Elijah's journey and want to know what happens next, make sure you subscribe to Behind the Hate. This story is just the beginning, and the twists are only getting started. Don't miss out on the next chapter, where the fight for justice takes an even darker turn. Hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when we release new episodes. And while you're here, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and tell us what you think James and Elijah should do next. Do you think they'll finally get the truth? Or will the system push back harder than ever? Share this video with your friends and family so they can join the conversation too. We're in this together. Let's uncover the truth, one story at a time. See you in the next chapter.